G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Daniel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're up to section 7. Now, this as in our prayer, this is a study that is put together by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, the head of RL Ministries worldwide. And we're very grateful to him for that. We're into session 7. We're looking at chapter 4, verses 19 to 37. We're in this section of the dream of the great tree from verse 1 to verse 37. King Nebuchadnezzar was at rest in his house. He's enjoying the benefits of his conquest. And then he had a dream which made him very fearful. So he called in the wise men, but they didn't make the interpretation known, either because they didn't know what it was, or they simply didn't want to make it known because it was a bad dream. And then Daniel comes in last of all, and Nebuchadnezzar calls him the master of magicians, because that was his position, which he gained that position earlier on. He sees Daniel as a master astrologer, and he knows that there's no secret that troubles him, because Nebuchadnezzar sees him as one in whom the spirit of the holy gods dwell. But Daniel doesn't receive his information from the stars, but he receives his information from the creator of the stars, the God of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar's dream was of a great tree. It was a huge tree reaching to the heavens, and its influence spread throughout the earth, all over the earth. Everyone benefited from this great tree, all flesh fed from it. It was the ideal picture, wonderful, peaceful scene. But then the image was shattered when the Holy One, an angel, came down from heaven with a decree to destroy it, to cut it down, remove its branches, scatter its fruit everywhere. But it is not totally destroyed, because its stump is to be left in the earth, and it is to be banded with a band of iron and brass, which would help protect it from the elements. Judgment is then pronounced against this stump. It will be wet with the dew of heaven. It's going to have its portion with the beasts in the grass of the earth. And this stump, this individual, his heart will be changed from that of a man's heart to a beast's heart. And this is going to last for a period of 7 times. And we know that in the book of Daniel, times means years, 7 years. Now, what was the intent of this? The intent of this is so that the living may know that it is the Most High God who rules in the kingdom of men. And as he is the possessor of heaven and earth, he gives it to whomever he wills, and he is the one who raises up and brings down rulers. Now, Nebuchadnezzar now asks Daniel to interpret this dream. And now we come to the interpretation, which goes from verse 19 down to verse 27. We see Daniel's reluctance to interpret it in verse 19. First of all, like the wise men, Daniel now also shows a reluctance, but for a different reason. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was stricken dumb for a while, and his thoughts troubled him. King answered and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation trouble you. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, the dream be to them that hate you, and the interpretation thereof to your adversaries. So Daniel immediately recognizes the meaning of the dream, and again, it is not because of astrology or the practice of sorcery. He got it straight from the God of Israel. But he didn't like what the interpretation was, so he didn't respond right away. He was troubled. It causes him to be stricken dumb, it says. And just as the dream now troubled Nebuchadnezzar, the interpretation troubled Daniel. It says his thoughts troubled him for a time. Finally, seeing the effect on Daniel in verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar says, Let not the dream or the interpretation trouble you. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar says, Listen, don't worry. I can handle whatever you have to tell me. Remember the last time Daniel interpreted a dream for Nebuchadnezzar back in chapter 2, it turned out favorably for the king. Perhaps he feels it could be so again. At any rate, he calls upon Daniel to come forth with the interpretation, regardless of how it may go. He says, I'm prepared to take it. At the end of verse 19, Daniel starts to let the king know that there's going to be a negative rather than a positive element to this dream. That's why he says, the dream be to them that hate you, and the interpretation thereof to your adversaries. In other words, although this interpretation applies to Nebuchadnezzar, because of the evilness of the interpretation and the meaning of the dream, Daniel issues a typical Jewish curse. May the dream and the interpretation of the dream be for the benefit of your enemies, because this should not happen to you, it should happen to them. And then we see in verses 20 to 22 the meaning of this great tree that the dream was. The tree that you saw, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair and the fruit thereof much, and it was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the birds of the heavens had their habitation. It is you, O King, that are grown and become strong, for your greatness is grown and reaches unto heaven, and your dominion to the end of the earth. So as Daniel now begins his interpretation in verses 20 to 26, in verses 20 to 22, he defines the meaning of the tree. The description of the tree in verses 20 to 21 is repeated from the dream itself. In verse 22, the interpretation tells him that the tree represents Nebuchadnezzar. Just like the tree, Nebuchadnezzar the king had grown and become strong. And similarly, his greatness had grown and reached unto heaven, and his dominion to the end of the earth. And that was by divine grant. As we saw back in chapter 2, God did give Nebuchadnezzar authority over the entire inhabited earth. It was a divine grant, though he never chose to exercise it. So this tree represents him in the height and the power of his glory. And we see the meaning of this decree in verses 23 to 26. And whereas the king saw a watcher and the Holy One coming down from heaven and saying, hew down the tree, destroy it, nevertheless leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass and the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is in verse 24. This is the interpretation, O king. And it is a decree of the Most High, which is come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass as oxen, and shall be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomsoever he will. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be sure unto you, after that you shall have known that the heavens do rule. So in verses 23 to 26, he now interprets the meaning of the decree of the angels. The bad news he wanted to keep from the king. In verse 23, he also reiterates the coming of a watcher and a holy one, an angel from heaven. Now, according to verse 17, the decree was decided by the angelic assembly. Now, this is the interpretation, O king, and it is the decree of the Most High. So this verse now clarifies that the original source is ultimately from God the Most High himself. The decree, like the tree, will be fulfilled in the lifespan of Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 25, Daniel spells out the judgment that will fall upon Nebuchadnezzar. First of all, he will be driven from men. Second, his dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And third, he was going to eat grass as oxen. Fourth, he is going to be wet with the dew of heaven. This means that he's going to be living outside, not inside. And the fifth thing we see is that the duration of this will be until 7 times pass over him. That is, it will last for 7 years until he learns that the Most High, who possesses heaven and earth, rules in the kingdom of men. And being the Most High and possessor of heaven and earth, he gives it to whomsoever he will. It is his decision, not Nebuchadnezzar's. But the judgments we see here will not be one of totality, because in verse 26, there's a promise of preservation. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, so just as the stump was to remain and was bound by a band made of brass and iron, your kingdom shall be sure unto you. So that means that the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar would be preserved, to be ruled by him again after those 7 years have passed. Now, no one would be allowed to take advantage of this period of his insanity. He would not be executed by a usurper. Neither would anyone attempt to take his throne while he was in this condition. However, it was going to continue for 7 years, because that is how long it's going to take for Nebuchadnezzar to know that the heavens do rule in the kingdoms of men. This is a judgment upon Nebuchadnezzar. But there is a way of escaping it. And it is given to us in verse 27, where Daniel spells out the possible solution for his king. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto you, and break off your sins by righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if there may be a lengthening of your tranquility. So Daniel's advice for Nebuchadnezzar is to do 2 things. First of all, break off your sins by righteousness. In other words, stop sinning. Not to obtain salvation by works, but by faith. Break off your sins by righteousness. Now, righteousness, we know, is only obtained by faith. And in this case, it is faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Daniel. So to break off your sins by righteousness means to be justified by faith. He has to place his faith in the God of Israel. Second, having exercised faith and having been saved once and for all, then break off your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. So this is a reference, to specific acts of sin which can be abandoned by showing mercy to the poor. So following justification, having exercised faith, and having been saved once and for all, then Nebuchadnezzar should do the works that follow salvation. So what we have here is an early principle that is fully developed by James, the Apostle James, that one shows his faith by his works. It is faith and faith alone that will save a man, but a faith that saves is also a faith that works. So works will be the evidence that a man either has faith or not. So break off your sins by righteousness means to exercise faith, and prove your faith by your works in showing mercy to the poor. Now, this was the key Old Testament way of showing works that were based upon faith in accordance with the law of Moses. So this advice we find in the Epistle of James as well. So if Nebuchadnezzar were to do this, then there would be a lengthening of your tranquility. In other words, that this very decree he had just dreamed about could be delayed, if not totally cancelled. If only the king were to do this, then he'd not have to suffer the judgment which his dream clearly threatened. However, just as we saw back in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar fails to take Daniel's advice. Then in verses 28 to 36, we see the fulfillment. In the 28 to 30, we see the sin. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. The end of 12 months, he was walking in the royal palace of Babylon. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built for the royal dwelling place, by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? So here we have the sin. Verse 28 is a summary statement of the paragraph. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the dream was fulfilled when all this happened exactly 12 months later, according to verse 29. His sin is a sin of pride. And the announcement in verse 28 is made by Nebuchadnezzar himself, that all this did come upon him. By then, a year after Daniel had interpreted his dream regarding the tree, the memory of it had dimmed somewhat, so that he's no longer troubled by his dream. He thought, well, that's just a dream in the past. So he's walking one day in the royal palace of Babylon, from which he could see the entire city laid out before him, which he had personally been responsible for building. And suddenly he was filled with pride. And in verse 30, the content of his pride is this: is not this great Babylon which I have built as a royal dwelling palace, as a royal capital of the empire? And how did I do it? By the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty. Back in chapter 2, he should have learned that it was God who had brought Babylon into being. It was God who had made Babylon great, so that he would use Babylon to punish the nation of Israel. Now, Nebuchadnezzar feels that he could take the credit for all of this. He had personally experienced the power of this God of Israel. Yet only a year after his last encounter with him in his dream, the king now boasted that he had built Babylon entirely by himself and for his own glory. By the way, Daniel 4 is not the only place where we have Nebuchadnezzar's braggamony. Critics used to scoff at this chapter because they could not believe that this really happened. Yet we know that Nebuchadnezzar was prone to bragging such as this, and we have two inscriptions which he wrote that have been dug up by archaeologists, in which they say essentially the same thing he said in verses 29 and 30. Here's a quote from the first inscription, which is something he wrote. Then built I the palace, the seat of my royalty, the bond of the race of men, the dwelling of joy and rejoicing. Notice how similar this first inscription sounds to the words of chapter 4. It certainly shows that it was written by the same man. Second inscription reads as follows: in Babylon, my dear city, which I love, was the palace, the house of wonder of the peoples, the bond of the land, the brilliant palace, the abode of the majesty in Babylon. So, in his own words found in secular records dug up by the spade of the archaeologists, we have verification that these words in Daniel 4 are indeed the words of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Babylon, the great city, he calls it in these verses. He really did build up Babylon, although he did not recognize that it was only by God's power. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was the largest city in the world. It was surrounded by two walls, an inner wall and an outer wall. Very high walls these were. On the top of the outer wall could be driven 4 chariots abreast. It was so wide. The wall itself was surrounded by a deep moat that was always filled with water. This city also had 12 gates, which opened up to 12 wide, expansive streets. They were much wider streets than were normal for that day and age. There was one main street which was some 900 meters or 1,000 yards long. It led from the Ishtar Gate and ended at one of Nebuchadnezzar's favorite temples. It was decorated on both sides with enameled bricks showing 120 winged lions, the symbol of the god Ishtar, 575 dragons, which is a symbol of the god Marduk, and 575 bulls, which is a symbol of the god Baal. This was what lined the streets. All of this formed a backdrop for the royal processions. Of the 12 gates, the most famous gate was the Ishtar Gate, and there's a reconstruction of the gate found in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, Germany. It opened onto a wide street leading to the largest temple in the city, the Temple of Marduk. There are more than 50 different pagan temples to 50 different gods within the city walls. The river Euphrates ran through the middle of the city itself. Any excess water was drained off by canals to the Tigris River. The city had a population of some 200,000 people, which for that day was a very sizable population. The most famous tourist attraction in Babylon that made it so great was not its concept of hugeness and its fortifications, which were included in its greatness, but its hanging gardens. These were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was built for one of his favorite wives called Amytis. She longed for the cool climate, the mountainous terrain and stunning scenery of her native Media. And in comparison, her new home in Babylon, which was hot, flat and dusty, must have seemed colorless and dull. It's believed that the gardens were planted on top of a tall structure made of stone that resembled a mountain in some way, perhaps by having multiple terraces. And on each of these terraces, there was a row of trees, and there were vaults to hold up the different edges and terraces. If you look at the city from a distance, the garden looked like it was hanging down over the wall. It was cascading flowers, bushes, and trees from Amytas's homeland, Media. They were planted on top of and overhanging the walls. That's what I call it, the hanging gardens. Large amounts of water were necessary to keep these exotic plants alive in the desert. So it's said that an engine, not a mechanical engine, but an engine run by oxen, pumped water up through the building from a well located below or from the river itself. So the king built this magnificent garden to give Amytas a constant reminder of her homeland. And this palace was then built next to these gardens. Now we know from his own records that this whole thing was built toward the latter part of his reign, when his conquests were completed, including the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for a total of 43 years. He had finished all his conquests by the end of his 30th year, and then he began building. So the judgment, the events of Daniel 4 would have happened sometime after the 30th year of his reign. So he had 13 more years to go to the end of his reign, 7 of which he would live in complete insanity. The description of Nebuchadnezzar's judgment now comes in verses 31 to 33. While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from you, and you shall be driven from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen. And his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair was grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. So now in verses 31 to 32, as Nebuchadnezzar just finished declaring how great was the city he had built, and was patting himself on the back for it in his pride, a voice now comes out of heaven. This voice issues its own decree. Now it has come. The concept of a voice from heaven is important in rabbinic theology. In Hebrew, it is known as a bat kol, B-A-T-K-O-L, which means a daughter of a voice. It refers to a type of heavenly or prophetic voice announcing the will of God to man. The bat kol appears frequently in rabbinic literature and is by no means an unfamiliar or obscure idea. In fact, cast your mind forward to the baptism of Jesus. We had a voice out of heaven. That was a bat kol. At his transfiguration, we had a voice out of heaven. That was the bat kol. Now in verse 31, this came while the king was still speaking. As he was making this braggamoney about how great he was and how he did this city, suddenly a voice spoke, and the voice decreed, to you it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from you. His kingdom would now be removed from him. And in verse 32, the sentence is pronounced, mirroring the dream, word for word. Thou shalt be driven from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. Thou shalt be made to eat grass as oxen. In verse 33, we read of the fulfillment of the sentence. It came the same hour as when Nebuchadnezzar made his statement of pride while he was speaking, insanity struck. Now everything Daniel had prophesied happened. Because the king became insane, he was driven from men. He was put away from society, and he did eat grass as oxen. By the way, this has been known to happen several times in human history. They even have a Latin name for this sickness. Nebuchadnezzar was suffering from an uncommon form of insanity known as boanthropy. B-O-A-N-T-H-R-O-P-Y. Boanthropy. Such cases have been known where people begin to eat grass like an ox or a cow. So suffering from this form of insanity and thinking himself to be an ox, he goes out into the field where he lives with other animals. His body did become wet with the dew of heaven because he's not living inside a building but outside. And two things were added here which were not revealed earlier in the dream. His hair grew and became thick and unkempt, like eagle's feathers, and his nails, his fingernails, toenails, took on the shape of talons like a bird of prey. So there are two new things there. Now, critics of the book of Daniel used to scoff at this chapter in early days, not accepting, that the great king Nebuchadnezzar could have survived 7 years of such insanity and still regain his kingdom again later. For years it was claimed that there was no other record of this ever happening, and it must therefore have come out of Daniel's imagination and never really happened. However, there are no records of the king's actions or decrees between 582 and 575 BC, which was a period of 7 years. Nothing was written about any of his decrees. This is unusual in that the rest of his reign is well documented, except for this 7-year gap. But a lot of this criticism has now been silent, thanks again to the digging of the archaeologist. We do have some archaeological records now which show that something very unusual did happen to Nebuchadnezzar toward the end of his career. One such record that was dug up comes from the 3rd century BC. Berosus, a Babylonian priest and astronomer of that era, recorded that after 43 years in power, Nebuchadnezzar suddenly fell ill. Berosus' text was preserved by Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, who quoted it at length against Apion, which he wrote to debunk those speaking against God. And the reference to the illness that preceded Nebuchadnezzar's death is unusual because sickness was typically not mentioned in ancient records. The fact that Berosus still described it may be a reference to the uniqueness of Nebuchadnezzar's illness. As such, it does not sound all that unusual because normally people do become ill before they die. But when they recorded the death of other kings, they do not say that he first became ill and then died. Normally the sickness preceding death was not mentioned in the ancient records. We simply read that he died after reigning for so many years. In this one exception to his record, though, Berosus says that Nebuchadnezzar did take ill. And the fact that he mentioned it, whereas it was usually ignored, shows it was some kind of unusual sickness and may be a reference to its uniqueness. But even more graphic is a second document which has been discovered. This comes somewhat later. Eusebius was a church father living in the 4th century AD, but he quotes a Greek historian named Abydainus, who wrote in 268 BC, who in turn is quoting another Greek historian, Megasthenes, who wrote in 300 BC. So these are the words of the Babylonians themselves, quoted from two pagan historians, not from believers of Scripture. And this is what the Babylonians quoted. Afterwards, the Chaldeans say, Nebuchadnezzar, on going upon his palace, he was possessed by some god or other. And he uttered the following speech: O Babylonians, behold, I, Nebuchadnezzar, announced to you beforehand the coming calamity, which my ancestor Bel and Queen Beltis are alike powerless to persuade the fates to avert. The Persian mule Cyrus will come, having your own gods as his allies. He didn't actually name Cyrus, but that's who the Persian mule was. He will impose servitude upon you and will have for his helper the son of a Median woman. That was Nabonidus, the boast of the Assyrians. Would that before he betrayed my citizens, some Charybdis or a sea might engulf him and utterly destroy him, or that having betaken himself elsewhere, he might be driven through the desert, where there is neither city nor track or men, where wild beasts seek their food and birds fly free. And he goes on a bit more. Now, another translation of Eusebius' text states that Nebuchadnezzar ascended the roof of his palace. So having uttered this prophecy, he forthwith disappeared, and evil Merodach, his son, succeeded him on the throne for this period of time. Now, there are four things common between the Daniel 4 account and this account of Nebuchadnezzar's speech recorded by this Greek historian. First of all, he says first that Nebuchadnezzar was possessed by some god or other. Now, back in those days, the insane were deemed to have been possessed by a god. So in both accounts, Daniel's account and this Greek historian's account, we know that the issue was insanity. Second, in both accounts, Nebuchadnezzar was said to have been on the roof of his palace. Third, in both accounts, he suddenly disappears from the scene. He was driven from among men to live among the wild beasts. And the fourth thing, in both these accounts, the event in question occurred toward the end of his reign. So we do have archaeological evidence that the events of Daniel 4 really did take place. One more piece of archaeological evidence is the prayer of Nabonidus, who was a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. But he seems to say of himself what actually happened to his father-in-law. This is the words of the prayer made by Nabonidus, king of Assyria and of Babylon. The great king, when he was smitten by a malignant disease by the decree of the Most High God in the town of Tamar. I was smitten by a malignant disease for a period of 7 years and became unlike men. And when I had confessed my sins and faults, God sent me a magician. He was a Jew among the exiles of Babylon. He gave his explanation and wrote an order that honor and great glory should be given to the Most High God. And thus he wrote, while you were smitten with a malignant disease in the town of Tamar by the decree of the Most High God, you prayed for 7 years to the gods of silver and of gold, of bronze, iron, wood, stone, and clay. Then the inscription breaks off and we don't have the rest of it. However, again, there are a lot of similarities here. He was sick for 7 years, and the guy who finally bailed him out of this situation was a magician, a Jew from Babylon. And notice that is exactly what Nebuchadnezzar called Daniel. He's a master magician. So the spade of the archaeologists have certainly validated these accounts. So this actually did happen to Nebuchadnezzar. Now we see the restoration in verses 34 and 36. So for 7 years now, Nebuchadnezzar lived in a state of insanity. And in verse 34 to 36, we have the restoration just as predicted in the dream itself. And the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he does according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what do you? At the same time, mine understanding returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent greatness was added unto me. So the restoration of Nebuchadnezzar in verses 34 to 36 finally comes to the point of his confession in verses 34 to 35. He says, at the end of the days, that is, at the end of the 7-year period, he lifted his eyes up to heaven, and suddenly some degree of understanding returned to him in his insane state, sufficient at least for him to understand that his dream had been fulfilled in his lifetime. He thought he was an ox. So after 7 years of looking on the ground where his eyes were constantly focused on the ground, he suddenly lifted his eyes skyward, and that was his turning point. The ability to recognize God is a fundamental difference between man and animal. And as his eyes lifted skyward, his sanity returned sufficiently for him to be able to bless the Most High. He praised and honored him, God Most High. And suddenly his understanding returned in full force. And now he understands the nature of the God of Israel. First, he lives forever. Second, he has an everlasting dominion. Third, his kingdom is from generation to generation. Fourth, in verse 35, All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing before him. And fifth, he does according to his will in the army of heaven. Sixth, he does according to his will among the inhabitants of the earth. Seventh, none can stay his hand. Eighth, none can object and say, what do you? Verse 35, as was mentioned earlier, uses Old Testament terminology which goes back elsewhere in the Old Testament. The statements of verse 35 are contained in Job 9:12, Psalm 145:13, Isaiah 40 verse 17, and Isaiah 45:9. And also we're going to see here in Daniel 4:34 to 35. In verse 36, his kingdom and throne are now returned to him. At the same time as his understanding returned, his insanity left him. At that point, as he acknowledged that God Most High is indeed the only God, the prophecy concerning the tree banded with iron and brass is also fulfilled. Nebuchadnezzar was restored to his throne. He received all his glory back, and the majesty of his kingdom was returned. He says his counselors and lords sought him out. He did not have to fight to get his throne back. Normally, that is exactly what would have happened. In fact, the verse says he received greater excellence now than before his insanity. God had promised to preserve his throne for him during that 7-year period, and God's promises were now fulfilled. The conclusion in verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are truth and his ways justice. And those that walk in pride he's able to abase. In the conclusion of the proclamation, he praises the King of heaven. He says, I praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. For 3 reasons. First of all, for all his works are truth. Second, all his ways are justice. Third, the lesson of this chapter is given at the end of verse 37. Those that walk in pride he's able to abase. He did at least learn that lesson. But it does not seem that he really learned the lesson Daniel wanted him to learn earlier in this chapter. To break off your sins by righteousness and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. So we can say from verse 37 that Nebuchadnezzar, can we say from verse 37 that Nebuchadnezzar was a saved man? Nothing he says here violates the principles of polytheism. All he has recognized is that the God of Jerusalem is a superior God. But Dr. Fruchtenbaum does not think that he actually repudiated the worship of other gods. He has come as close as one could come without being saved. He failed to acknowledge the God of heaven as the one true God of heaven and earth. A second lesson from chapter 4, which is part of the greater context of Daniel in the times of the Gentiles, is that the pride of Gentile world power will eventually be brought down. It will be allowed to go so far that eventually God will bring it down. This is where we're going to leave this session this week, because the next session we want to try and do in one hit, not have it split. So thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.